great length, early voting. And there is another approach, of course, which involves absentee voting. What have you found relative to those who use each opportunity? Those more likely to engage in early voting as opposed to those more likely to engage in absentee voting?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very not well-kept secret by politicos in Florida about which political party tends to vote early versus have their supporters vote absentee. The Republican Party of Florida has been very successful, and it's quite admirable in terms of their efforts to reach out to their supporters, having them request absentee ballots and having them sent in. Democratic Party, for whatever reason, has chosen not to go that strategy. There is clearly a difference in terms of looking at those half of the population that was registered to vote in 2008 in the general election that voted early as opposed to absentee. And it's almost opposite in terms of Democrats disproportionately voting early, Republicans disproportionately voting absentee. What I should note is that HB 1355 does nothing to affect anything with respect to voting early through an absentee ballot. And in fact, if you want to talk fraud, and the supervisors I'm sure can attest to this, in the state of Florida, when there is voter fraud, it's through absentee ballots. It's not done on election day. It's not done through early voting. It's not done with Mickey Mouse registering and then voting. It is done through absentee ballots. The percentage is very small, but it exists. We just had a Florida Department of Law Enforcement investigation of a absentee balloting fraud going on in Madison County, the Madison 9, I think they're known as, in which a local school board election, several individuals in support of a candidate solicited absentee ballot forms for other people, either filled them out or were there when they filled them out and advised them on how to fill them out, and then brought them back into to the supervisor of election. Nothing in HB 1355 touches this type of fraud. In fact, it makes it easier for individuals who are not the person who's going to be voting on the absentee ballot to request an absentee ballot and have it sent not even to that person's address that's on the books. So if the state legislature really wanted to crack down on fraud, certainly they probably should have considered at least some of these problems with the absentee balloting that goes on.
Mr. Parks, you said at one point in your testimony that the census data indicates that African Americans and Hispanic citizens in Florida are more than twice as likely as whites to register to vote through private voter registration drives. In 2004, that translated to 17.4% of African Americans, 18.9% of Hispanics registering through voter registration drives, compared to 6.6% non-Hispanic whites. In light of these figures and the testimony we've already received, sworn testimony, about the negative impact this has had on third-party, nonpartisan organizations involved in voter registration, I think the conclusion is fairly obvious, but I'd like you to state it.
Well, without question, when you put that type of burden on third party, especially students, my background is as a student leader, and on the campuses, when you have students who want to have voter registration drives and voter registration drives in the broader black community, folks are not going to do it given the burden that's been placed on them by this House bill. So without question, it's very clear that by putting this extra burden on them, those numbers are going to go down, given the heavy burden they now have to face.
Mr. Wilkes, is that the way you see it?
Absolutely. I think when you consider the fact that Latinos and African Americans are more likely to have moved and changed address, so they need to be registered, or Latinos are more likely to be new citizens and need to register, they're getting missed by the traditional registration strategies that exist in any state, but here in Florida as well. And because of that, the third-party voter registration efforts are absolutely key to make sure that those voters get registered. And this is a chilling effect on those efforts. They're trying to frighten us into not doing our job. And it's unfortunate because we're really helping the state. We're helping them preserve the democracy here in the state, and yet The feeling amongst all of us is that when you go to a volunteer, like Matilda, she's worked for 50 years for this organization, trying to help people register to vote. I'm going to tell her that she could get fined $1,000 because she's trying to do something that she's done all this time. That's going to scare our volunteers, it's going to scare our staff, it's going to scare your organizations, and a lot of the members of this Quad Coalition have already said, you're not going to register voters anymore in the state.
Mr. Pemberton, the earlier panel talked about students marching from Bethune-Cookman, correct? Historically
Yes.
Black college, coming in to register, and Supervisor McFall noted that if the students had changed dorm addresses, they would be given provisional ballots, not reflecting on her county specifically, but rather the statistics from Professor Smith. I was shocked by the wide disparity of what happens to provisional ballots. Under the best of circumstances, from your report, 60% are counted in the end. Under the worst, I shouldn't say that. You had a few counties that had 100%. There were
Very small.
half dozen counties that had 100%. But in the ones you reported, 60% as against 6.3%, which goes to your point. If students don't think their ballots are going to be counted because they've changed dorms between elections, they're discouraged from participating. Is that not the case? I mean, you said as much, and as I listen to those provisional ballot statistics, it really reinforces it.
It is. We have to bear in mind that college is an opportunity for students to really learn about the political process and begin their endeavors in civic engagement. It's hard enough to get them to the polls, and now as they're discovering, the ones that are becoming involved, that it's a common practice in university that when you come back, you may not be in the same dorm that you were in when you got there, and now when you go to the poll and you've taken this time to do these things and get informed about the candidates and take the time to vote, that your ballot has a at best 60% chance of being counted. That's not an incentive for a disenfranchised group of people to vote.
Let me just, I'm going to close, if you don't mind, Bill, Senator Nelson, by referring to the testimony of Superintendent Earl, because he made this point several times, and I told him I was going to bring this up when Professor Smith was here. And I'm going to read his testimony verbatim based on his own sampling and conclusions. And he said, so while we don't have real statistics on the voting habits of hardworking single mothers, I pulled the real data for the Black and Hispanic community from the only statewide election conducted under the new law, the current election. Based on my data, Superintendent Earl said in testimony, from this very election, Sunday is actually the least likely day that a Black voter will cast their ballot, and the second least likely day that a Hispanic voter will cast their ballot. Of all the Black voters who have cast an early voting ballot in the first 5 days of this election, only 7% did so on Sunday. Of the Hispanic voters who cast an early voting ballot in the first 5 days of this election, only 16.95% did so on Sunday. Could you react to Superintendent Earl's observations?
I wouldn't deny that his statistics are correct, but let's look at the context of the presidential primary election that's going on right now. Last I checked, President Barack Obama doesn't have an opponent in Florida. In fact, Democrats aren't given a presidential ballot to vote on. They may have some local races if you're a registered Democrat or if you're a registered no-party affiliate. Republicans are the ones that are turning out, and we know the proportion of both Hispanic as well as African American Republicans in the state. It's a fraction of what a general electorate in a general election is going to look like. I would encourage Mr. Earl to go back and look at his statistics from Seminole County in 2008, when it was admirably one of just a handful, 10 states, 10 counties that actually allowed Sunday voting. And to look at the proportion of African Americans and Hispanics and whites that voted on that final Sunday in his particular county. I can assure you that it's going to look very much like this figure, which disproportionately African Americans and Hispanics came out to vote on that final Sunday relative to the white voters who voted the rest of the week at a much higher proportion.
Thank you. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wilkes, from your testimony, if someone is unfortunate enough to have their home foreclosed, and they have to move into rental housing. You mentioned in your testimony that the law fails to take that into account, the new law. Can you elaborate?
Absolutely. If they have to move across county lines, in the past, they could go in, they could vote, not a provisional ballot, an actual vote, and at the same time update their address. In the new law, without explanation, they've now said it's a provisional ballot that you vote. You can still update your address, but now you're voting with a provisional ballot, which we've just learned rarely gets counted. So these are folks who've already been devastated. They lost their homes, they lost their income, and they are trying to participate still in our democratic process and hope that they can elect someone who can see their plight and take action to help those individuals. And then they go to the ballot box and they're told they can't count, they can't vote an actual vote that's going to be sure to count. I think that's despicable, honestly. I mean, I can't imagine why the state of Florida, why would they do that to these poor folks? We know it's a huge problem in this state. Why aren't they helping them? Why are they trying to make life more difficult for them?
So a demographic that is more likely to rent because of income level, and a demographic that would more frequently change addresses as renting one place and then moving to another. If it crossed the county line, they're going to be caught in this catch-22. Is that your testimony?
That is absolutely correct, with the addition of, unfortunately, once again, those folks tend to be disproportionately African-American, Latino, seniors, folks who are most likely to be disenfranchised in the first place. And now there's yet another additional burden being imposed by this bill.
Mr. Parks, would you elaborate on why the houses of worship are a place to encourage voter participation in your experience?
Well, I think certainly without question, Senator Nelson, historically one of the challenges in the African-American community has been getting the voter involvement. And so that has continued to be a huge battle in the African-American community. Then we get to the point where, because we tend to socialize traditionally in the churches, as probably the #1 place in the African-American community, it became the place that African Americans could use as a place to encourage each other to vote. I think you have to also think about the work dynamics here. I think most African Americans tend to have to work, if not one job, sometimes a second job to survive in certain situations. That the one time that you do get a chance to socialize in our community is at church. And that's why, probably more so than ever, it's so important that the churches be allowed to have that Sunday participation, which we're being denied. I think without question, though, from a legal standpoint here, we realize that this particular law has a disparate impact on African Americans. And I think that becomes, I think as senators, one of the points that we want you all to consider in your discussions as you consider this House bill.
Professor, you had written about the fact that Florida, in this presidential primary, is operating under 2 different laws. The 5 counties, including this one, Hillsborough, that are under the watch under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, are under a set of 1 laws, which is the old law, and the remaining 62 counties are operating under the new law that is the subject of this hearing. You want to comment on that?
Yes, I mean, it kind of makes a mockery of Bush v. Gore in terms of having some uniform standard in which everyone in the state needs to be voting under. We've had early voting going on for almost 2 weeks in those 5 Section 5 Voting Rights Act counties, which are still under the jurisdiction of the Federal Justice Department, and they have not yet granted pre-clearance because of concerns about how truncating that Sunday voting as well as eliminating that first 5 days of early voting may affect disparately different demographic and racial minorities. I find it terribly ironic that here in Hillsborough, the early voting's been going on since Martin Luther King Day, that Monday. Next door, just going across the causeway over in Pinellas County, it didn't start until that following Saturday. And of course, in Hillsborough, you'll be able to vote early on that final Sunday, as opposed to in other counties surrounding it.
So if you live in Hillsborough, this is Friday, you can vote this Sunday.
That is
But
correct.
if you live in Pinellas or Pasco, you're not going to be able to vote in the Republican primary this coming Sunday.
That is correct.
Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions. I'd like to make a concluding comment at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. Thank you very much to the panel. I suppose the first and obvious question is, why is this subcommittee meeting in Tampa today? Why have we decided to come down here and address a state law, Senate Bill 1355, changing the voting process in the state of Florida? Some people might say, well, everybody watches Florida elections, at least since 2000. And that's true. More eyes have been focused on this state since the year 2000 than many other states. Secondly, people would say, well, Florida is in a special category when it comes to the Voting Rights Act. This is a 50-year-plus legacy of some very better experiences where the federal government continues to supervise and pre-clear laws on voting to make sure that there is no discrimination. That is certainly true. The third point goes to some testimony given by the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court before our Senate Judiciary Committee when he was asked about voting. And he said of voting, the right that is preservative of all other rights. The right that is preservative of all other rights. We value our rights in this country. All across this political spectrum, we value them. But most fundamentally, we value our right to vote. Because that determines whether we will maintain this democracy, whether we'll maintain the confidence of the voters in this democracy, and whether we'll continue to set an example for the world. An example which they frequently cite when they take to the streets and the polling places in their countries and determine what their future will be. We want to be like America. We come here today and have heard testimony, and I thank both panels. I thought all of them did an extraordinary job in laying out what this issue really comes down to. The decision by the Florida legislature and the governor to change the law is going to work a real disadvantage to some people. It is going to limit the opportunity for early voting. It is going to limit the opportunity for nonpartisan groups to register people to vote. It is going to limit the places where people can vote. And unfortunately, it is difficult to escape the political reality. It is going to have a greater impact on minorities, on blacks and Hispanics, on the young and the poor and the elderly than on other groups. That is not consistent with the values that we should bring to this conversation. I thank Senator Nelson for this invitation for the first field hearing of this committee. I think it was appropriate that we were in Tampa, Florida today discussing the right that is preservative of all other rights. Senator Nelson.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for making this a historic field visit at a very important time. On the basis of your comments and the comments of all of the excellent panelists, and we do appreciate everyone. I was reminded that it was in the 1800s that Susan B. Anthony, who was trying everything that she could for the rights of women, made a very similar statement to what you just quoted Chief Justice as making. That she said all the other rights are going to be protected only if women have the right to vote. And so too, we have seen that struggle in our country's history. The contrast, as the chairman has mentioned, with other countries. Look what is going on in Syria right now. Now, this country is unique in the Constitution and its legal system and the rule of law. That is what sets us apart from the rest of the world. that is something that we must preserve. And so, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for coming down here, because I think that that rule of law has been assaulted here in this state by this election law under the pretense of cutting down on election fraud. And for you to come here with this committee to underscore how high the stakes are right now. Can you believe that America in the year 2012 is facing this challenge? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
As a measure of the interest in this hearing, we not only have a packed courtroom, but there are more than 200 people in the overflow rooms watching this hearing as well. In addition, dozens of organizations have submitted statements for the record, including the ACLU, NAACP, the Brennan Center, A. Philip Randolph Institute of Central Florida, Disability Rights Florida,